Over the summer, I decided to make my own haunted dream game, and it started here. The goal was to make a dream game concept that was heavily inspired by the arcade classic Space Invaders, and I find when working on a game concept, establishing a certain amount of parameters really helps with the timeline, because otherwise anything and everything is possible, but my time is still very finite. And with that being said, creating a locked-off camera game felt like a great place to start. And as we jump into this devlog, I want to give some credit to PixelArt Pope. Ever since I started Gusty, I've been using his camera solutions for PixelArt games, and it just works really, really well. And I feel every time I use them, I begin to understand them even more and more and more. So thank you for constantly teaching me how to use cameras. I'll go ahead and post the link to his videos down below. I am still very new to development, and this devlog is my experience making this haunted dream game concept and everything I learned along the way. Okay, so what is this dream game even about? Well, if you can't tell from this riveting gameplay, it's about a dream fairy that's protecting a sleeping, dreaming child from impending nightmares like taxes and bills and cringy memories that you thought you'd forgotten about. So yeah, it's a literal dream game, and a haunted one at that. This particular mock-up only took me a few minutes to do, and I'm quite tickled by it because I've made 3 game concepts this year, and every new idea feels particularly daunting, and it's just fascinating to see something come together so quickly. And if you can't tell from these shooting peas that our dream fairy is shooting, we still have a long way to go, but the basic principle is here. We just need to finesse the mechanics and maybe even the art. And our first big obstacle is we only have 1 spook haunting this little dreamer, and we're gonna need a whole fleet. And to do that, I ended up creating a nightmare spawner that just spawns a bunch of nightmares in each individual row. And what that looks like is this red box is my spawn box, which is gonna go through and create the total number of spawn boxes and go ahead and make all those layers. I think maybe to make that visible, I'll make sure their depth is in front of this red box. And then the purple box is what this red box creates, and this is the actual object that moves our nightmare sprites. So once the spawn box spawns, it's going to create all the nightmares within that box, and every single nightmare when it's created, it will know what its spawn box is called. And that's how that basically all works. So you can see these individual purple boxes, and they just move back and forth until it hits the edge of the border of the red one. And I can still use my little pea shooter to destroy the nightmares, and if the nightmares hit the end of the screen, they'll destroy themselves. So overall, a pretty strong start. They do move pretty smooth, so we're going to try to figure out how to make them look a little bit more steppy, like the classic arcade game. Because I'm using these nightmare spawners to actually translate our spooks, one effective way to move them in this more stepped fashion is using alarms. So whenever I move the nightmare, I'll just set the move to false and trigger my alarm. And then here I go through the individual rows and kind of step them slowly over time. So I probably will add a little bit more movement delay to this, but you can see this is a bit more stepped and a bit more in line with the arcade game. But we should try to figure out how to make this more of a fair fight. And here's my little pea shooter that I have for the fairy. It just creates this object bullet, and I went ahead and decided to get the nightmares one too. But I didn't want to have all the nightmares fire all at the same time. So in the master spawn box, I have an alarm that allows a nightmare to fire, and it scrubs through the DS list of available nightmares. And if it finds a lucky nightmare, it will go ahead and set that fire haunt to true. And that's basically it. We still have to get the bullet to do some damage, but if we wait just a little bit of time, we should see some offensive actions from the nightmares. but it works, it functions. And we'll continue customizing this a little bit later to have them fire more rapidly as the difficulty in the game scales. But now finally, we have all these pieces. The fairy fires, the nightmares fires, and now we get to the part of the game that I'm very excited to do, and it's actually gonna be a very new process for me because we want the nightmares to destroy the tiles. First, I wanted to be able to tell the difference between the fairy firing and the nightmare firing. So I went ahead and swapped the nightmare's pea bullet into something that looks like a carrot. And now that everyone has their assigned vegetables, we can begin playing with the destroying of the tile maps. And for that, I created 2 rows of tiles, basically. The top row represents the undamaged room, and the bottom row represents the damaged version of the room. The hope is to get the width of the tile set and just move down 1 row whenever it gets damaged. But applying the code was actually way more daunting in my head because it turned out to be pretty simple. As I mentioned earlier, I got the width of the tile set and the tile size, and I just used that to jump to the next row and change the tile to a more destroyed version. So when we play the game, we can see when the nightmare begins to fire, it should turn one of these tiles Yeah, ta-da, to a more damaged tile. So proof of concept works, but it doesn't end there because there's more that I want to do. And also we need to add a limit to the destruction so it doesn't continue to try to retrieve a tile that doesn't exist. But that shouldn't be too hard to do. I just implemented a max damage amount and I progressed a tile until it reached that max damage. I also added an additional layer of damage. So we have undamaged, slightly damaged, and super damaged. And I created some examples of a wall here. So now our room looks even mightier. If I play through this, you can see that when a carrot hits a tile, it'll destroy and the carrot disappears too. But when the bullet reaches a tile that can no longer be damaged, it'll begin trying to damage the next row. So now the basic principle is done and we're using these new tile map functions that we haven't used before. I do want to add some flavor to the shape of how these tiles get destroyed because I don't want it to be one giant chunk of tile that disappears. And to do that, I think we're going to end up using buffers. So the first thing I had to do to try to give it a little bit more texture is I wanted more tiles to play with. So originally I had a 16 by 16 chunks, and having that whole tile disappear whenever it got destroyed just wasn't giving me the amount of definition I wanted. So I ended up switching to an 8 by 8 tile set. This will allow us to create some custom shapes. But creating the custom shapes, I did have to do a lot of hard coding that I didn't love, but I was able to proof out what I wanted to do. So in this example, I kind of grab like a left coordinate, a right coordinate, and a bottom coordinate. So I can kind of destroy the tile in like a T pattern. So when it detects a hit, I'll grab that tile ID, check to see if it's a valid tile. And assuming it is, I'll go ahead and destroy it and the surrounding tiles if I'm able. The result is good. It's better than having one giant square disappear. Hopefully one of our carrots come falling out of the sky. Boom. So now we have a nice, really cool T. And if it overlaps another T, it should still maintain max destruction limit. And that was like a perfect clean swoop there. But boom. Yeah, so we still got some extra destruction here, some extra destruction here, but it doesn't over destroy. So it works. This is good, but I have a bit of a fork in the road as I could potentially create custom shapes for multiple different types of destructions, because I do plan to have more than just one nightmare type. And I would like every nightmare type to have their own destruction. But I also don't want to draw a bunch of custom shapes using coordinates like this. I would ideally like to draw some sort of sprite, like a destruction pattern, if you will. And if I draw this pattern here, or a pattern like this, or even a pattern like this, when the tile hits, it'll know which pattern to destroy. But how do we do that? How do we make tiles explode a bit more dynamically? Well, a little while ago, I was working on a game that I didn't release, and it was about trick-or-treating with friends, so it was a multiplayer game. And doing the multiplayer game, I learned a lot about buffers. And by a lot, I mean a little, because figuring out networking in multiplayer games is quite a feat, and I admire anyone who can do it. I got something semi-workable, but I did get a decent grasp of how buffers kind of work, and I'm not the best person to explain it. There's a lot of really good resources out there, and for the most part, I understand enough to help me get by. But a huge shout out to this particular video, because they not only explain buffers, but they also explain colors and surfaces, which is exactly the kind of solution that I needed for this project, and the link to that video is in the description below. But here's an example of a series of sprites that I made. Each one represents a different explosion type. We have 3x2 for our little T, we have 3x3, of course moving up 4x4, and a lot by a lot, 7x7. So every exploded tile in this sprite is represented by 1 pixel. And if I turn on a grid, you can kind of see this is the grid, each grid's a pixel, and I draw white wherever I want a tile to explode. But don't be confused by the white color, because actually what we're looking at is just the red color. If you sample white and you look at the color, its RGB value is 255, 255, 255, 255 for the alpha, sorry, RGBA. We only really need the red channel, so it's white for us, but we only really care about the red channel. That's a pretty important distinction, and I'll show you why. Moving to how we create these explosions. So all those tiles I store here, I put them into an array. Then I also get the X and the Y origin of those tiles, so I know where to kind of explode or spawn the explosion from. I make an enum that I don't use, and I promise to get better at using enums later, and this is when we create the buffer. So for each of the sprites that I called out above, we're going to determine the buffer size. And when we determine the size of a buffer, you're basically determining how big it will be in bytes. And 1 byte equals 8 bits. And 8 bits can store number values of 0 to 255. So now you get the distinction on why we only really care about the red channel. I made a little note to myself here. If I wanted us to store the RGB and the A, I'd have to multiply the buffer size by 4. But because I only want the red channel, I only need to multiply it by 1, and actually not at all. But I keep it as a reminder to myself because it helps me. And then I create the buffer. And then the creation step is done. we're good here. But now we have to get to the more complex portion of drawing these sprites and storing their pixel values into our newly created buffer. And surfaces I truly am just now beginning to kind of understand. I got this to work and I don't necessarily know how I got it to work, but it works and that works. And I'll learn more from it as I continue reusing this code. But ultimately I create a surface that is the size of the sprite, and then I draw the sprite, and then I store that surface in the buffer. I have to understand it, but it works. But when you create a surface, you can use this constant. And basically what this says is that this format supports a single red channel with an 8-bit value. That's exactly what we're storing. So buffers created, red values are stored. And then we move the explosion code from our object bullets into something that just basically spawns the haunt explosion. And the haunt explosion, this is where all of it happens. And I'm not going to go through all of this because it might be a bit boring, but basically when the bullet hits the tile that it can explode, it's going to choose a random explosion or eventually an appropriate explosion. And then it's going to determine if that explosion hits a tile. And if it does hit a tile, it's going to determine if it's a valid tile. And if it's a valid tile, then it's going to go and grab that random buffer that has all the information and begins to destroy the surrounding tiles. And all it really needs to do is make sure it translates a 1 pixel offset into an 8 pixel offset, because that's the size of the tiles that we're destroying. And that's basically it, right? It's simple. It's a little repetitive here because I had something working, I just wanted to stay working. I could potentially turn this into a script and make it way more efficient, but it works and that's good. It's messy, it's dirty, but it functions. So now when our haunts begin to hit the tile, it picks a random explosion. It's cool, right? Look at that. I added a middle click option as well, so I can middle click and it'll randomly explode the tile as well. But yeah, it just functions. It's great. And now artistically, I can make any type of explosion I want. So if I wanted this to be a smiley face, and when something explodes, we'll eventually get a smiley face. The explosion could be whatever you want, and it's so cool, and it feels great, and it was such an accomplishment. This is a pretty monumental step in the development, and even when I was just now reading over the code I wrote feverishly under the moonlight, I just barely understand what was going on. It impresses me because I wrote this, but I also just kind of Mr. Beaned my way into a solution. What is beneficial about these types of devlogs is it's a fun retrospective because it kind of reteaches me how I even got this far to begin with. And me at the beginning of the project would think that this is most likely impossible, and now me near the end of the project, I just can't fathom how I overcame such an obstacle. It's just crazy. So yeah, learning's fun. Now that we have the fundamentals somewhat down technically, let's go ahead and explore some polish. There are so many great and amazing palettes on low spec, but with the help of Lightning, I landed on this one here. We thought it was fun, retro, modern, and a bit minimalistic with enough variety for some splash. And thank you to the artist, I'll share the palette below. So with this new fancy palette, we picked out a couple different colors for different groups, thinking maybe the lighter colors for one type of monster and the brighter colors for the fairy sprite. But we have our new ghost, or spook, and our temp assets just keep getting more refined because we also updated our tile set for the bedroom. This I'm particularly excited about because I was trying to figure out how the bedroom can get more and more destroyed, and I thought a really fun way to incorporate a destroyed bedroom is to not only make it destroyed but also haunted. Playing around with a couple different options here. We have our basic bedroom, and as the bedroom gets more destroyed, you'll notice that the wallpaper goes from swords to something that resembles a skull to something way more spookier, like a scary face, a ghost, and maybe like a demon or something. And then similarly for the floorboards, this is probably my favorite feature, to be honest, because it's so cool. Underneath the floor, we have like this design pattern. As the floor gets destroyed, we make it even spookier by adding some red pixels that kind of look like eyeballs. And we're going to refine this a little bit later, but I thought it was a pretty good start. But not only that, we also updated our sprite fairy. This little green monster now looks like this. This isn't perfect, but I try to put like the hint of a small fairy within the interior of the sprite and having like this glow look and this bit of wings here. If I hit play, it's a little bit of extra polish. You change the background color. The room gets more and more haunted, which I can't wait to continue exploring later. And yeah, our fairy just flies around shooting its little delicious peas. We probably should update the peas. I should call out my animation for the fairy sprite. I showed it to my partner and she says it looks like flapping pants. So yeah, we need to figure out how to make this look like a non-flapping pants later. But I really want to revisit that tile set in the bedroom. So you remember how I said I was going to try and make it look more haunted? But check this out. So now these faces in the floorboards do intentionally get more spooky. We have just something that looks a little innocent, then something where like a jaw is formed and a bit of a mouth shape, and then we get like the horns, the fangs, and the snoot, which is also here in the red lights. I love this concept so much. We added a bit more destruction as well to the wallpaper. We also added a couple optional things as well. So we have windows that get cracked and shattered, a poster that goes from a healthy mushroom to a poisonous mushroom to an evil mushroom, a drawing that gets ripped and torn, a little tiny mouse creature that lives in the walls, and a nightlight that gets turned off and then gets re-illuminated with, I don't know, spooky magic. It's pretty fun, but it's cool. This is infinitely expandable, right? I mean, I guess not infinitely, it's very finite. I can only go to here. If I make it bigger, I might have to redraw my tiles, and I don't want to redraw my tiles, but I love this idea of just adding more set decorations. So in the room proper, you can see it just looks a little bit better. We even updated the kid sprite a little bit. And we have these nice, beautiful stars in the background. So now when it does damage on the room, yeah, look at that. Little destruction edge there. The poster gets turned and it just keeps going down a layer of destruction every single time. Windows get shattered. Yeah, not bad, right? It's kind of cool. I like this a lot, and I want to continue adding more furniture pieces. So if you have any ideas, feel free to post them below. But the idea of this bedroom getting more and more haunted as the spooks do damage, I think is really nice because it does lean more into trying to protect a child from nightmares theme that this Space Invaders clone is developing. It's really fun seeing to come together. But what about the monsters? I do quite like our spooky nightmare, but I wanted to have different versions of them because the idea is that each version of the nightmare will have different bullets and different explosion radiuses and different sounds, etc, etc, etc. And I wanted the nightmares to be randomly generated too, so maybe like the ghost could have like 4 tiles and it picks one of each tile so they don't always look the same. But that was a bit more complex to engineer at this stage, so I don't know if we'll actually get to that. But I went ahead and added 2 additional nightmare variants. So we have our spook, and then we have our sordid heart that just kind of opens its mouth, and then we have our siren, which just flaps its wings. For no reason whatsoever, I decided to keep to the S theme. So this is our backup nightmare, but if we pull in our new nightmare, you can see it's called Nightmare Spook, Nightmare Sorted, like a sorted heart, and then our Nightmare Siren. I also wanted every nightmare to have its own fire animation and fire bullets, which you can kind of see over here on the right. So on the technical side, when the object nightmare gets created, it's going to choose which nightmare it needs to be based on its height in the room. So a Nightmare Spook is going to come with all these attributes. They'll determine its bullet sprite, explosion animation, firing sprite, and its idle sprite. So I do that for Spook, Sorted, and Siren, and when bullets get created, it just picks from that pre-established definition. Pretty straightforward, and I'm excited to show you some of the explosion animations, but first, let's see it all put together. So isn't that cute? Look at all of them up there. You get spooks, hearts, and bats. So when they fire, they have their own firing animation. And then when their bullets impact, they have their own bullet animations and impact animations. And each of them also has like a determined explosion sprite. So the big ones will be for the sirens at the top, and then the medium ones will be for the hearts, and then have 2 small variations for the spooks. But it's not too bad. It's not too bad. We need to continue adjusting these animations, but the concept is there. I'll have to highlight some of the explosions because I'm quite proud of them. The siren has this bullet here, which right now is just kind of like a sound wave thing. And its explosion is kind of like a swirling pattern. And then the sorted heart, I just get kind of like a pretty basic explosion with its bullet kind of looking like a vomit comet or something. I don't know. But the spook, I just refined his carrots, so it looks a little bit more lasery. And I love the spook's explosion so much. I had the spook explode into little tiny ghosts. Isn't that cute? It's fun. It adds so much life and texture to this game. I barely changed anything mechanically. It's just adding a little bit of polish. But now with all of these nightmares doing all of this haunted damage on the room, I think we really should establish some rules on a success and defeat. Like every other arcade game, when you destroy an enemy, I want you to get a score. And I did a scoring and a timer system from my previous game, Clover, so I was able to re-implement a lot of that logic, notably my probably very unnecessary process to convert game time to human readable time. Probably a better way, but it works. It's fun when you can rely on old projects to kind of give you fun little snippets of code to use for future projects. And you can tell my inexperience when I have lengthy variables called game timer human readable, but I'm only human. I also designed a health bar for the room. The health bar itself is pretty simple. There's a healthy state, a hurt state, and a defeat state. And then I cover all that up with a nice little window that also goes from healthy, hurt to damaged. And I just changed the index of the health bar sprites depending on how much of the tiles are destroyed in the room. So I'll show what all this is in a second, but we have a score, we have a timer, we have a health bar, but I also wanted the player to feel like it was more fun destroying the nightmares. So this one's pretty simple, but I created an explosion animation whenever the nightmares get destroyed. And although the animations are the same, it does mean that I have some room to customize these explosions if I wanted them to be unique per nightmare. But right now the only customization is the change of color palette to represent the base color in each of the nightmares. So let's go ahead and see what all that looks like. Here's our health bar, here's our score, and our human readable time. And when I move around to destroy a nightmare, poof, I get a little bit of points and they explode. I added a fun little pulse to the animations of the score counter whenever it reaches a value that's divisible by 100. And so we get that little boof there, which is really nice. You know, it's small stuff. It might be small potatoes, but every little bit, it just makes this game feel a bit more grounded. Not only did we work on adding all these little fun little effects, we also added a success and defeat message. I'm going to show you the success one first because I really like it. And I think I can use my developer hotkey to destroy all of these nightmares at once. There it is. Not bad, right? So there's a couple things going on with the success message. First, we do increase the score depending on your accuracy, the time it's taken to you, and how much of the room is unhaunted. But what I love about this is the success message. I wanted to have some glistening stars spell out a message similar to Star Road in Super Mario World, and I did heavily borrow from that sprite animation. I don't know how much I've modified it, but I had to reference it. But notably, I also wanted the freedom of placing these stars because I didn't want to have to like change a bunch of sprites every single time. And how do you think I did it? I did it in the exact same way that we are exploding all the tiles. So down here, I have a sprite called InMessage, and you can see it just says success. There's nothing crazy about it because I ended up also creating a buffer of those white pixels, and those white pixels will come with coordinates on where to spawn our object star, which this is the thing that animates. So if we do end the game with success, then we'll go ahead and get the width of the room and the height of the room to determine where our message needs to start. Spawn debug messages for insecurities. And then we're shuffling our DS grid that has the coordinates of all those white pixels, just so they always don't spawn the exact same pattern. But yeah, then we just thumb through it and go to every coordinate of the X and Y to spawn one of our star objects. And then I delay the spawn just a skosh, again, so they don't all like pop up all at once. So it should be somewhat different every single time. Not too bad, I think it works. And of course, my favorite thing about this is I can customize this to say anything. I think it's pretty cool and it allows for some fun messages down the road. And not to fish for ideas, but if you have some cool starry messages you want to see greet you in the night sky after you finish fending off a horde of nightmares, let me know. I do think it'll be fun to have a lot of fun options in there for the next update of the game. Oh, and I didn't show the defeats. I'm going to expedite the defeat by destroying tiles in the room, and you'll notice the health bar gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Defeat is based on the percentage of tiles, so once a certain number of tiles are destroyed, it'll just say defeat, and all the nightmares will go crazy. I need to work on the go crazy movement. I just tell it to go crazy whenever we enter the fail state, and it's not the smartest, because at a certain point they all get kind of slow, but like everything else, we'll refine it. So there were two things that did not quite feel right. One is the hitbox of the nightmares. They actually don't move left to right independently. They follow a box that moves left to right. So because of that, when they hit the invisible barrier on left and right edge, they're going to go in the opposite direction, which can look weird when you have a lot of the edges cleared already. They'll move down before they're ready to move down, just like that. So they've moved down, but the nightmares in the center haven't actually reached the edge of the barrier yet. I need to find the nightmares on the furthest edge. When they hit the edge of the barrier, have all the nightmares move down in pivot directions. And I've gotten to a situation where now all my nightmare sprites are animating out of order. monitor, but we're going to fix both of those things. So in this example, what I did is I've written a little bit of code that draws a kind of hitbox around the leading nightmare edge, and it's going to denote this nightmare as the leader. And when this nightmare, being the leader, hits the barrier, it's going to pivot direction and find a new leader. And whenever I destroy a nightmare, it's also going to find a new leader. So when this one hits the edge of the screen or the edge of the barrier, all the nightmares will pivot. And then when it pivots, it'll pick a new leader for this side, which is right there. So it works pretty well. And now what happens if I destroy a lot of these nightmares? So they'll all descend when this heart reaches the edge of the barrier. Easy peasy. So now they're no longer looking at their respective giant purple spawn boxes. They're looking at each of the nightmares and determining the leader, and it's pretty effective. And we don't need to delve too far into the nightmare code, but this is where the leader is getting determined. You can also see a little bit of early work that I'm doing for determining their overall global speed based on how many nightmares are left in the room. But if we go into the actual script where I'm determining the leader, it's pretty simple. A lot of messages to myself because I forget what I'm doing. But basically when a nightmare dies, it will remove it from the list of nightmares to consider, and then find the one with the furthest left X and then one with the furthest right X, and store those instant IDs as hitboxes. And whenever the nightmares move, which is still being controlled by the nightmare boxes, it's going to set the horizontal speed to basically whatever the move direction is that's determined by that script we saw earlier. So that's how it works. And you might have noticed a couple of things when we were playing, both I'm very excited about. So you remember earlier I was showing you an example of how all the nightmares are getting out of sync, because when I untether them from their purple spawn boxes as their main source of movements, they begin to kind of animate and draw on their own cycles for various reasons. In order to combat that, I actually created a bit of a metronome. So these two people will be invisible, but when they are changing their sprite animation, they're changing to the same sprite animation that the metronome is on. I had these guys on 3s to show all 3 movements that you might have seen earlier, but it felt weird. They were moving with 3 frames and everyone else is only moving with 2 frames. So I addressed one of those frames and I just had them moving just with the 2 frames now. But it looks pretty good. I also updated this firing animation of the spook. Looks pretty cute. And for the keen eyes, who's been following this devlog so far, you might notice the P is gone. We've updated the sprite for the fairy, give a bit of a sparkle, and hopefully the wings look less like flapping pants now. Still playing with it. But when the fairy fires, it has a little magic fairy missile. I'm gonna miss the P's, but I think this is more appropriate. I think we like this one. I think it feels good, and it's also just really rewarding just seeing the nightmares increase in speed and stay perfectly in sync with the metronome. So we'll have to say thank you to our hidden conductors. They will be invisible for the main game, but for those who know, you'll know that they're there, and I think that totally works. If they do fire, I have them break apart from the metronome so they can play their firing animation. Pretty straightforward, and this is my debugging hitbox, so we can turn that off. Yeah, and it all looks pretty normal. Our metronomes are hidden, and our leader hitbox is also gone. Not too bad. I think that works. It's hacky, but it's effective, and I'm excited that it's all working. And I do like our new fairy missile. It feels more appropriate, but the P will be missed. But I do find this new bullet sprite to be pretty appeasing. It's pretty good. That was a good joke. We'll keep that joke in. But I think everything is coming together, and you might continue to see some more subtle adjustments as we proceed. Okay, so everything's really coming together in our devlog, and I think now we can talk about adding sight and sound. There's a lot of good options out there for music, but also can be pretty overwhelming trying to find the perfect song. And I had some success with Stream Beats' chiptune library. And for the arcade one, I found a couple good ones. Felt like a decent sound to use for an arcade type of game. And also Kenny has some really good assets on itch.io as well, from 3D models to 2D pixel art, but even audio sounds from things like music jingles or impact sounds. There's also this really great utility called JSFXR, which has a web interface, and you can randomly generate a series of different sounds and different sample rates. I thought this was pretty fascinating. You can store the link if you want to continue customizing it, and you can also serialize it if you wanted to copy all the settings that you've applied and paste them in here for later for continued tweaking. Really solid, and I ended up using this a lot to be able to customize the sounds of the different nightmares. But it has been fun trying to find unique sounds to help identify the hearts, the bat, and the ghost. Like with anything else with the Nightmare, I've just been storing the sound inside the Nightmare's creation step when it determines which kind of sprite it's going to use. So here we're storing what it sounds like when the Nightmare fires a bullet, and the sound of the explosion when the bullet hits impact, and the sound of the Nightmare being destroyed as well. We also customize the random gain and random pitch of each of these sounds, so when they're all firing off all at once, it's just a little bit different, so the sounds don't feel like they're replicating themselves. And then all that information just gets passed through to the bullets, but I do have to acknowledge the siren sound, which I thought was pretty cool. I ended up using 2 different sounds, and I thought that really helped with the windy yet singy voice it might make when it's shooting its sound waves. I do have a lingering bug where if too many sounds are playing, all the sounds get muted. I might need to see what the limitations are, how many clips can play at once. So if you have any advice on that, feel free to let me know. I will use it and hopefully be able to apply to the next update of the game. My biggest piece of advice to anyone who is doing sounds for the first time is to take the opportunity to normalize your audio. Because your audio can come from so many different sources, some of the audio might be very, very quiet and other parts of the audio might be very, very, very loud. And as a result, when a lot of sounds are playing, some could get clipped and it feels very awkward and unnatural, like something stepping on something. And the way I did it is I actually used Voice Meter Banana for my audio recording software. And I ended up just playing each of the sounds to see where they hit on the mixer and continued lowering them until they all kind of hit at the same spot. And that seemed to work. It was pretty successful. And here's what all that sounds like when you put it together. And just in case you wanted a more quiet experience, I added little sliders to adjust the audio levels. So that's 1 bar for music and 1 bar for effects. And you might be noticing a new cursor that we have and also a little P. This is just a temp icon, but now I can show you a little bit of what we did to the site of the game. I initially wanted this game to have a very retro feel, so I ended up buying my first big boy purchase for game development that I'm very excited about, and check out what it does. We have a fun little CRT arcadey look, and that's why I have to add the cursor inside the game, so as it distorts across the camera, the cursor moves with the curve as well. And it's pretty cute. I like it. And the purchase I was referencing is this post-processing effects package by Foxy of Jungle. The effects package does a lot, and the documentation is really well written. I'm looking forward to continue exploring it, but as I said, everything's nicely documented within the code, as well as the manual. So great documentation, great powerful shader, fairly easy to customize. Overall, I'm just very happy with it. I quite like it. But now let's talk about choosing your bed and choosing your hair. I wanted to give the player some level of customization in case they want to change the color of the bed or even the color of the hair. So we added those features into the game. It's so simple and subtle, but I like it. So now with this button here, you can cycle through a bunch of different colors for the bed. And with this button here, you can cycle through a bunch of different colors for the hair. I think at some point too, I want to do like sleeping Z's or something, just to give the character a bit more life. I also updated the sprites for the nostalgia mode. And if you look close, I gave it a little tiny face. I like that. But now let's talk about protecting this sleeping kid a little bit more from these nightmares. So at one point, I decided that it might be nice if the player had more utility on what they're doing in this game besides just shooting. And because this is like Space Invaders, but instead of hiding behind the environment, you're trying to protect the environment, I thought maybe a cool feature is the player has the ability to spawn little shields. So just like that, you can spawn 3 little shields, and that'll protect from a little bit of damage in the room. And when both hits have been absorbed, the shield will go back into your ammo. So you can strategically move around the room and try to place it to catch certain bullets. I'm not sure how much I love the shield ammo sprite. I was going to have a meter showing your shield ammo, but I decided against it because I didn't want to have more UI elements, and I wanted the indicator to be kind of closer to the player sprite. I also created a little metronome for the shield ammo as well. For the revolving code, I was actually able to reuse some of the code I wrote for my Power of the Force game, where I just have an orbit here, and all the shield ammo picks up that offset from the metronome and just rotates it around the player sprite. So effective, and it works. And at the moment, the player sprite will just press shift to spawn a shield, but I'm also looking for a different key for that as well. So I'll have to keep thinking about it. I think shifts for Windows can get pretty spammy because it could trigger like a shift toggle. Maybe shield can be S, maybe that's okay. S for shield. But if that feels awkward and should be a different button, I'm open for suggestions. And that's it. We're nearing the end here. It's been a long road. I will have a small moment of silence, if you will, for some of the cut features from the game. Just to name a few, I thought it'd be fun to have a shooting star that you can randomly hit for more points. I like the idea of the nightmares being able to trigger something to respawn themselves. And on stream, we were also talking about some sort of mechanic that could animate some objects in the player's room. Like maybe you can use your fairy magic to activate a toy robot that can walk left and right and heal some patches on the room. And the list goes on, but I am happy with the progress that we've made and didn't want to end the project adding a little bit more polish. And for me, I thought a really good polish was fairy dust. So now when the player sprite moves left and right, it has a little fairy dust. The player can also move up and down a little bit now just to give them a little bit more freedom of movements. But I thought the fairy dust was fun. It's a little cute. It's neat. I had my first exposure to particles when I was working on the Clover game. This one works somewhat similar, but is a little bit different. 1UP Indie does have a good introduction to particles that I found useful. But for the fairy dust, I create 3 different types of particles that each have different sizes, different colors, different opacities, just to help it not all feel same. But I ended up doing an alarm event that kind of triggers these particles on and off. And as a result, yeah, we have this nice little variation of fairy dust. I find particles pretty exciting and I want to continue working with them, but little by little, adding little by little over time. No rush, no rush, no rush. Looks pretty cute though. I quite like it. In addition to that, some of the polish I did was continue refining the enemy timers because I wanted to make sure they felt notably more difficult as they were depleting from the screen. And before I show that, I should mention that I gave each row of enemies different points. So 100, 200, 300 points and little floating numbers too. Look at that. It's just tiny little baby floating numbers. I think it's kind of fun. And then I can show you the enemies getting slower as well. I mean faster. So as I destroy more and more of these, they begin to speed up. I know I've been letting them cook for a little bit, but they have been doing some pretty remarkable damage to the room. And when they get pretty fast, they get pretty fast. It's me having to use my shield just to block some damage. Oh, and then I got defeated. But what I also did was change the firing animation, or add one, I should say, because before one could just spam the bullets and you can just create a wall of bullets and you could just really kill enemies pretty fast. So now when you fire, there's a little animation that plays that kind of helps reinforce that there's a bit of a cooldown. And when the animation ends, you can fire another bullet. So it allows you to be a bit more strategic with your bullet placement. So you can't just spam it too willy-nilly. The other thing too I wanted to prevent is the ability of the player just to wait out the enemies, because when they hit the room, they're just going to explode on their own. So now when an enemy hits a tile, it'll explode 2 rows of tiles. As a result, if every row of enemy were to hit the room, you would eventually fail by default. So don't let them hit the room because they'll explode and haunt the whole thing. But yeah, I need to work on my timing a little bit. Sometimes it feels like the enemies do get a little too fast and crazy. Oh, yeah, it's pretty difficult. I'm not using my shields, I guess, enough. Oh, we did it. Okay. Whew. That was a lot of spamming. That was actually harder than I thought it would be. And one thing I did as well is when you succeed, I give you the player the freedom to fly all over the room. So it was a nice little touch. Nice, cute little touch. I also need to continue adjusting some of the colors and saturation and contrast for the nostalgia mode. It might be a little too dark, so I'll continue playing with these as well. But yeah, that's basically it. There's a couple of small quirks and bugs I still need to fix, but for the most part, it functions, and that's pretty solid, not a bad spread. There is one more change I'm going to make, which I'm going to talk about it now and then show you, but I wanted to make a menu title screen. I wanted this menu title screen to be pretty simple, but also be able to show the player how to play the game. So what I hope I'm showing you is a dream game title, the ability to move the fairy around, fire bullets, and spawn your shields and destroy nightmares. And when the player is ready, they can just hit play. So we're going to work on that next before we wrap the game up and then post it up on itch. So overall, this was meant just to be a really short project, as it usually is. I was hoping to knock this out within just a week. And if I want to give myself a lot of unnecessary credit, I was able to knock out the basic principle of the game within just a matter of a few days. It was the retooling, the refining that took some time, and then of course the hiatus I had to take in the middle. But we did it, we cleared it, we made my haunted dream game over the summer. I do look forward to maybe improving this and making it better, so all suggestions and feedback is appreciated, because it's kind of fun just to kind of evolve and develop these things. The game is free. It'll be on itch.io. I did intend it to be a web game. However, the tile collisions don't work the same, and I currently didn't have the time to try to fix it. If I fix it later, I'll do a post on Twitter or here on YouTube. But for the time being, you can download it on Windows. It's totally free. You can play it and share your score, which is determined by accuracy, time, and how haunted your room is. But yeah, that's it. We did it. We'll see what happens next. I'm going to go back and work on something else I'm pretty excited about for the spooky season that we're having. And again, yeah, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for any feedback, criticisms. I hope everyone has a great and safe, fun fall season. And good luck fighting off little nightmares and fending off haunts in this tiny little dream game.